The general did not offer his hand. He kept it flat against the map table, fingers spread over the contour lines, like he owned the mountains printed there. And he looked at the small woman standing in the doorway of the operations tent, the way a man looks at paperwork filed in the wrong drawer. Corporal Tova Rysel stood 5'3" in her boots. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. She had walked 11 miles of switchback road that morning to reach this firebase, and the dust of it was still on her jaw. And when Brigadier General Aldous Fenwick finally spoke, he spoke to the captain beside her instead of to her. "This is the specialist they sent me." It was not a question. The way he said specialist made it a small joke. And 2 of the officers along the tent wall smiled the way men smile when the powerful make jokes. Fenwick had 30 years on his shoulders and a voice built for parade grounds, and he had asked for a marksman to fill a gap in his line, and what had arrived was a woman who looked like she could be knocked over by the door flap. Tova put out her hand. She held it there in the space between them, steady, unhurried, and the seconds stretched. 3, 4. Fenwick looked at the hand and did not take it. He looked back at his map. "We'll find something for you in the rear," he said. "Range work. Ammunition counts." 5 seconds. Tova lowered her hand. Her face did not change. It was a stillness that a careful observer might have found strange. Not the flush of someone humiliated, not the tightness of someone swallowing anger, but the flat waiting calm of someone who has been here before and knows exactly how it ends. Her eyes moved once across the map on the table, across the ridge lines and the marked positions and the red grease pencil arc where the general expected trouble, and something behind them did a quiet piece of arithmetic and put the answer away. She did not yet know that in 9 days the general's own voice would break saying her call sign into a handset. He did not know it either. He had already turned back to his officers. What none of them knew, because none of them had read past the first line of her file, was that the woman he had just refused to touch held 3 of the longest confirmed shots in the history of her service, and that the last man who had underestimated her at a distance had done so from 1,900 meters and had not finished the thought. If you have ever been counted out by someone who never bothered to learn what you could do, stay with me, because this one travels a long way, and the moment the general stands up out of his chair is a moment I promise you will want to see coming. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're listening from, because I like to know how far these stories reach. 9 days from now, a man with a star on his collar is going to say 2 words he swore he never would. Stay to the end. You'll hear them. The firebase was called Ridgeback, and it sat in the high desert where the mountains of 2 countries leaned against each other and pretended there was a line between them. Cold at night, blinding by 10 in the morning, the air so thin and dry it pulled the moisture out of a person and gave nothing back. Wind came down the passes in the afternoon and rearranged the world. It was terrain that ate flatlanders alive, and it was the only kind of ground Tova had ever felt entirely at home in, because it was the kind of ground her sister had taught her to read. Not a grandfather, not an old soldier with a worn keepsake. Her sister, Yael, 4 years older, still very much alive, currently instructing at a range 2,000 miles from this valley, and still capable of making Tova feel 12 years old over a bad phone connection. Yael, who had put a rifle in her hands when Tova was small and furious and picked on, and had said the thing that became the spine of everything after, "You don't get to be the biggest. You don't get to be the loudest." So you're going to be the one who's already done the math while they're still talking. Not stillness. Not listening for the quiet. Arithmetic. Cold. Fast. Finished. Before anyone knows you started. Yael had drilled her until the math was faster than fear, and the two of them still argued about wind holds in text messages, and the last thing Yael had sent before Ridgeback was a single line. Don't let them make you small. You're not. You never were. Tova carried no token, pressed nothing to her chest. What she carried was the arithmetic, and a way of going flat and quiet while she did it, that people kept mistaking for weakness. She stowed her gear in the corner of a supply tent because no one had assigned her a bunk. She cleaned her rifle on her own cot that first evening, in the open, and that was where the witness found her, though he did not know he was a witness, and would not understand what he had seen for another 9 days. His name was Private First Class Dov Emmer, 19, a supply clerk with ink stains on his fingers. And he stopped because he had never seen anyone handle a rifle the way she did. Not fast, not showy. Every motion landed exactly where the next one needed to start. No wasted travel. Hands that seemed to already know where each part would be before it got there. He watched her seat the barreled action back into the stock and torque the screws by feel, checking nothing, needing to check nothing. You're the one the general put on ammo counts, Dov said. I am. He watched a moment longer. He didn't have the vocabulary for what he was seeing. He only knew it looked like the difference between someone playing an instrument and someone who had become one. Seems like a waste, he said finally. Tova looked up at him. It was the first thing anyone on Ridgeback had said to her. That wasn't a dismissal, and something in her face eased by a single degree. Count's the count, she said. Somebody's got to be right about the numbers. He didn't understand that either. He would later. He would remember it exactly. The captain who had walked her in was named Captain Prieto, and she had her own version of the doorway treatment to endure, because Fenwick ran his fire base like a country he'd inherited and did not intend to share. Prieto was the fire support officer, sharp and young for the job, and she had spent 3 weeks watching the general wave off her range estimates in favor of his own gut, which had been very good in a different war on different ground. When Prieto had suggested that the marksman they'd requested might actually be worth reading up on, Fenwick had told her, in front of the tent, that he'd been placing shots since before she could walk. Prieto had learned to make her points and then go quiet. She found Tova at the ammunition connex the next morning, counting, because Tova did what she was told even when it was an insult. You've done range work before, Prieto said. It wasn't quite a question. Some. That's not what your file says. The part he didn't read. Tova kept counting. What's it say? It says you have shots on record that most people think are typos. Prieto leaned against the connex. It says a review board once made you repeat one under supervision because they didn't believe the first one. It says you did it again on the second try, cold, and then handed back the rifle and asked if there was anything else. Tova closed the ammo can. She looked at the captain with those flat, calculating eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she let a person see one layer down. There's usually something else, she said. Prieto almost smiled. It was the beginning of the only real alliance Tova would have on that firebase. 2 people the general had decided to look through, recognizing each other. Over the next days they talked quietly, in the language of people who both knew the trade. Dope cards and density altitude. The way the afternoon wind in this valley didn't just push, but stacked, layering at different speeds, at different heights, so a bullet had to survive 3 different rivers of air on the way out. Prieto had been logging that wind for 3 weeks, and no one had wanted her data. Tova wanted it. She read every page. She asked questions that made Prieto sit up, because they were the questions of someone building a model of this valley in her head, angle by angle, and filing it away against a day she clearly expected to come. "He's going to need you," Prieto said one evening. "He doesn't know it. This valley's going to hand him something his gut can't solve, and he's going to need exactly the person he stuck on ammo counts." Tova didn't answer. She was looking east, out past the wire, at a ridgeline she had been quietly ranging with her eyes every day since she'd arrived, filing it, doing the math while they were still talking. It came on the 9th day, and it came at the worst hour, the way these things do. A resupply convoy, 4 trucks and a security element, 22 people, running the switchback road up from the valley floor, hit a blocking position in the tight ground below the eastern ridge. The first Ridgeback heard of it was the radio going from bored to screaming in the space of a breath. Small arms fire, heavy, from elevated positions on both sides of the road. The convoy was pinned in a killing stretch with rock walls to either side, unable to go forward, unable to turn around, and the volume of fire coming down on them said this was not a handful of fighters. This was a planned ambush by people who had chosen their ground and knew how to use it. Fenwick was in the operations tent in 90 seconds, and the map that had been a decoration under his hand became the whole world. The problem was ugly, and it was immediate. The enemy shooters were up on the ridge shoulders, in rock, at ranges his own security element couldn't effectively answer from down in the ditch. Every quick reaction option he had would take 40 minutes to reach the mouth of that road, and the convoy did not have 40 minutes. He had mortars, but the enemy was hugging close to the pinned trucks now, danger close, and dropping high explosive onto that was a way to kill his own people. He had aircraft an hour out. He had a radio full of voices that were starting to sound like men who knew they were going to die. He had a marksman counting ammunition 200 meters away. Prieto was already talking, fast, laying it out. The elevated positions, the ranges, the wind. The fact that the only thing that could touch those shooters right now, without gambling the whole convoy, was one precise weapon in one pair of hands, from the high pad on Ridgeback's eastern berm, which had the angle and the elevation to look down into those enemy positions. She had the ranges because she'd logged them. She had the wind because she'd logged that too. She had everything except the authority to make the general do the one thing his pride had spent 9 days refusing. Fenwick looked at the map. He looked at the red arc he'd drawn there on the first day, and at the exact ground where his gut had told him trouble would come, and trouble had come there, and his gut had had no answer for it. On the radio, a young voice was calling that they had wounded, that they couldn't get to them, that the fire wouldn't let up. "The specialist," Fenwick said. The word did not sound like a joke now. It sounded like something being dragged out of him. "Get her on the berm." Prieto was already moving. But the general stopped her with 2 more words, and every officer in that tent heard what it cost him to say them, because they were an admission, and Fenwick did not make admissions. I was wrong. Tova was on the eastern berm 4 minutes later. She hadn't run. Prieto noticed that, in the part of her mind that wasn't on fire, the woman had walked up to the high pad at a fast, steady climb that got her there with her heart rate flat and her hands quiet, because a sprinter arrives shaking and a marksman arrives ready, and Tova had understood the difference so completely that she'd chosen it without thinking. She went prone on the pad. She built her position with that same economy. Dov had watched on the cot, bipod, rear bag, cheek weld, the rifle becoming an extension of the ground, and her body becoming an extension of the rifle. Prieto dropped beside her with the range card and the wind log, and for 1 second the two of them were just two people who knew the trade, and everyone else fell away. "Talk to me," Tova said. "2 positions I can see. North shoulder, rock cluster, 1140. South shoulder, higher, the notch, 1280. Wind stacking, same as we logged, quartering, worse up high." Tova's eye was already at the glass. The valley she had been building in her head for 9 days was in front of her now, real, and it matched the model, and the matching of it settled something in her chest into pure, cold arithmetic. She keyed her radio for the first time since arriving at Ridgeback, and the voice that went out over the net was not the voice of a woman who'd been put on ammo counts. It was level, unhurried, and it carried the specific authority of someone who has never once been wrong about a number that mattered. "Ridgeback element, this is Overwatch. I have your northern shooters. Keep your people down. I'm working." In the operations tent, Fenwick's head came up at that voice. She started on the north shoulder. First shot, the report cracked out over the berm, a hard, flat snap that rolled down the valley. And 1140 meters away, a shooter in the rocks stopped shooting. "Prieto, glass up," said the number without drama, because that was the job. 1. The wind pushed. Tova felt it lay against the left side of her face, and she'd already given it away, already held for it, because she'd done that math 9 days ago and every day since. Second shot. A different sound as the round went out, and, a beat later, the distant tick of it, finding rock and the thing behind the rock. 2. The enemy on the north shoulder understood, faster than she'd have liked, that their elevated safety had become a trap. They started to move, shifting between rocks, and the tally kept climbing, 3, 4. But now they were harder. Now they were only showing a shoulder, a boot, the top of a head for half a second, and Tova took what they gave her and made each fraction of exposure enough. Prieto called them off one at a time, her voice staying flat by sheer will. 5, 6. "They're displacing south," Prieto said, "crossing to the other shooters." "Let them cross," Tova said. "Longer for me, shorter for the trucks." Sound layered over the berm, her rifle's flat crack, and under it the different noise coming up from the valley. The enemy's fire, a deeper stutter off the rock walls, and threaded through all of it, the radio. The convoy calling that the northern fire was slackening, that they could feel it slackening. 7. The 7th man had tried to carry a long weapon across open rock, and Tova had read where he was going before he did. Then the first moment, the outcome truly hung in the balance. A shooter she hadn't accounted for, not on the shoulders but low, close to the pinned trucks, in a fold of ground Prieto's angle couldn't see. Opened up not on the convoy, but on the berm. On her. The first Tova knew of it was the air itself changing beside her head, a sound like a wasp made of glass, and then the crack of a round striking the pad a hand's width from her elbow and spitting grit across her cheek. Every instinct in a human body says move. Get down, get behind something. Tova felt the grit sting her face and heard the second round come in and register the shooter's position from the sound of the first, even as it was still happening. All of it inside a single second. The angle, the distance, low and left, maybe 400 meters. A child's range compared to what she'd been doing, except that he was already zeroed on her, and she had to move her whole gun to get there. She didn't flinch off the rifle. She wrote it. She let the recoil of a breath settle her, shifted her weight, brought the muzzle down, and left in one continuous motion that cost her maybe 2 seconds, found the fold of ground, found the muzzle flash, winking in it, and put a single round into it. The wasp stopped. Her cheek was bleeding from the grit. She never registered it. 8, Prieto said, and her voice cracked on it, just slightly, because she'd been close enough to feel that round go by too. Back to the notch, Tova said, already climbing her scope up to the south shoulder, to the 1280 position, where the crossed shooters and the original ones were now stacked in the high rocks and starting, finally, to understand the full shape of what was on the berm above them. The tally climbed 9, 10, 11. She worked the south shoulder with a metronomic patience that had nothing serene about it, and everything arithmetic about it. Range, hold, wind, break, the next number, the next. The wind-up high was doing exactly what Prieto's 3 weeks of ignored data said it would, and because Tova had read that data, she was the only person in the valley holding for a wind that no one else even knew was there. 12. The convoy's radio traffic was changing, the panic bleeding out of it, replaced by the disbelieving voices of men who had been ready to die and were, somehow, not dying. Then the second time, the outcome hung in the balance. The enemy commander, whoever he was, made the smart move. He put fire on the berm from 3 directions at once, ranging in with heavier weapons now, walking rounds up the face of it, toward the pad where the muzzle reports kept coming from. The high pad, which had given Tova her angle, became the most dangerous place in the valley. Rounds came in low and long, one skipping off the lip of the berm and screaming away, another striking somewhere below the pad hard enough to shake it. Prieto flattened. Tova did not. She lay in the incoming fire and did the coldest thing a person can do under it, which was to keep working the problem, because the trucks still had shooters on them, and the only thing standing between those shooters and the convoy was her staying on the gun while the world tried to knock her off it. She felt the berm shudder under her sternum. She heard a round pass close enough to feel its heat. She logged the heavier weapon's position from its sound, and she made a choice that no manual would recommend, and every convoy on that road would have voted for. She ignored the fire coming at her and stayed on the fire going at them. 13, 14. She took the last 2 shooters off the trucks while rounds were trying to find her spine, and only when the convoy's guns had gone from defensive to silent, because there was nothing left to shoot. Did she roll off the crest and let Prieto pull her back below the lip. 14, Prieto breathed. 14. The road's clear. The road's clear. They're moving. Below them the convoy was moving again, trucks lurching forward out of the killing stretch, and the radio was full of voices that didn't sound like men dying anymore. But it wasn't over, because clearing the road and saving the people on it were 2 different problems, and the second one was still bleeding. They brought the wounded up to Ridgeback as the convoy broke free, and the worst of them was a security team gunner named Ephraim Katz, 41 years old, a reservist who fixed heavy machinery in civilian life and had a wife and a mortgage and a plan to be done with all of this in 5 months. He'd been hit in the ambush pulling a younger soldier out of the lead truck's cab, and he'd kept working the fold of ground with his own weapon long after he should have gone down. And now he was on a litter outside the aid station going gray, and there was 1 surgeon, and there were 3 wounded, and the triage math was not kind to the man who was quietest. Tova came down off the berm, with grit still drying on her cheek, and found the aid station overwhelmed, and she did the thing that no one at Ridgeback knew she could do. because they hadn't read past the first line of her file, where it also said, in a line the general never reached, that before she was ever a marksman, she had spent 3 years as a combat medic. The same hands that had just worked a rifle at 1,200 meters knelt in the dirt beside Ephraim Katz and went to work with the same unwasted economy, fast and sure, buying the surgeon the minutes he didn't have. Katz was conscious, which was its own kind of cruelty. His hand found her sleeve and gripped it. His eyes were losing focus, but they fixed on her face, and he asked her the question that everyone in that circumstance asks, the one that has nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with whether it's safe to stop being afraid. Am I going home? She could have said the true thing, which was that she didn't know. She could have said the kind, vague thing. She looked at him, and her voice, when it came, was as level as it had been on the radio, and it did not offer him hope. It offered him a fact. You're going home. 5 months. You already told them you'd be there. Her hands never stopped. I don't miss. Not up there. Not down here. Something in him believed her, because there was nothing in her that allowed for not believing. His grip eased. He held on to that promise like a rope, and it kept him present long enough for the surgeon to reach him, and the surgeon, who had watched her work for 90 seconds before he took over, said afterward that the man would have been gone if someone with real hands hadn't gotten to him in the first 4 minutes. Ephraim Katz went home, not in 5 months. But he went home, and he walked to his own door. And that is the end of his part of this, except that you should hold on to his face, because Tova did. For about an hour, it looked like it was over. The road was clear. The wounded were stabilized. The convoy was inside the wire, and the general had said his 2 words and meant them. Fenwick had come out of his tent and stood at the bottom of the berm and watched the small woman work on a dying man in the dirt, and something in 30 years of certainty had gone quiet in him. It looked like the story could end there, with the general owing her a debt and knowing it. It didn't end there, because the ambush on the road had not been the objective. It had been the bait. While Ridgeback poured its attention down the switchback at the pinned convoy, a second enemy element had used the hour to do the thing they'd actually come to do, and the first the firebase knew of it was a forward observer's frantic call, and then the deep, wrong sound of an explosion rolling down the valley from the north. From the high span, where the only paved road out of the whole sector crossed the gorge on a 2-lane bridge. They hadn't dropped it. They'd tried, and failed, and that was worse. They had wired the bridge's main support and touched off a charge that had cracked but not severed it, and now the span hung wounded over a 300-foot gorge, sagging, groaning, held up by a single compromised support cable and a structure that was failing by the minute. And on the bridge, stopped dead when the charge went off, was the lead ambulance carrying the overflow of wounded that Ridgeback's aid station couldn't hold, plus its driver and a medic. 6 people, frozen on a collapsing span with a drop under them that no one survives. And the enemy, having failed to drop the bridge cleanly, had left a man behind to finish the job the hard way. Prieto got it first, reading the observer's report, going white. There was a fighter in the rocks on the far side of the gorge with a heavy incendiary weapon, and he was not shooting at the people. He was shooting at the last cable, the one compromised support holding the whole span up. And every round he walked into it brought the bridge and the 6 people on it closer to the gorge floor. He had cover. He had time. He had a target the size of a wrist at the base of the far tower. And the ambulance couldn't move, because the span wouldn't take the weight of it rolling. and the people couldn't run, because there was fire between them and the near side. And the bridge had, by the observer's shaking estimate, minutes. This was the problem that Fenwick's gut could not solve, and he knew it now. And knowing it was the thing that let him do what he did next. He went to the radio himself. Not Prieto, him. Everyone in the operations tent watched the general pick up the handset to call the woman he had refused to shake hands with 9 days and 1 lifetime ago. And they watched him hesitate, because a man does not unlearn 30 years of himself in an afternoon. And the word he had to say was her call sign, and the thing he had to say after it was help. The silence went 4 seconds. 5. In the tent, a captain looked at the floor to give him privacy for it. 6 seconds. Then Fenwick keyed the handset, and his voice came out rougher than any of them had ever heard it. Overwatch, this is Ridgeback 6. A breath. I have 6 people on the north bridge, and a shooter cutting the last cable, and I have nothing that reaches him but you. I'm asking. 6 lives. The cable, or the bridge, goes. Tell me you can do this. Every person in earshot heard a general say, "Tell me you can do this to a corporal." And no one ever forgot it. Up on the berm, Tova was already moving to the north-facing pad, because she'd heard the explosion and read the smoke, and started building the problem before the call came. Prieto ran the data with her, and the data was brutal. The far tower base, where the cable anchored, was 1,760 meters across the gorge. The target, the shooter tucked into rock beside the cable, was not the hard part. The hard part was the cable itself, because the shooter kept ducking to cover between his shots, exposing himself for barely more than a second at a time, and hitting a man behind rock at that range in a 1-second window was a feat that lived at the outer edge of what the weapon and the woman could do. And there was worse. The wind through the gorge was not the valley's stacking afternoon wind. It was a channeled river of air ripping through a stone funnel, gusting and dropping, and at 1,760 meters, a wrong red on it would push around a full body width off in the time it took to arrive. They could not solve the wind. That was the thing. Prieto worked it every way she knew, and could not give Tova a number she trusted, because the gorge wind wouldn't hold still long enough to be a number. And Tova did not have a timed window to wait for. There was no lull coming, no seam in the storm. The wind was chaos all the way down. What she had was worse and stranger, and it was the far shooter himself who gave it to her. Because the shooter, every time he leaned out to fire at the cable, did something with his own body that told the truth about the wind. Tova saw it on the 3rd time he exposed himself, the way his loose outer garment pulled and snapped in the gust at the instant he leaned out, the fabric streaming off his shoulder at an angle and a violence that was a perfect living readout of exactly what the air was doing at his end of the gorge in that precise second. The wind at her end she could feel. The wind in the middle she could infer. The wind at his end, the last and most important third of the bullet's journey, was written on his own clothes every time he showed himself to shoot. She couldn't wait for the wind to be right, but she could read, off the snap of his garment, what the wind was in the 1 second he was exposed, and fire into that reading, matching her shot to the truth his own body told, in the same second it told it. It would not repeat. It was not a cycle to count. Each exposure was a new and different reading, and she would get one chance to see the garment, solve it, and break the shot inside the same fractional window before he ducked back, with 6 people on a bridge that was running out of minutes while she waited for the exposure that gave her a clean enough red to trust. "I can't give you the wind," Prieto said, and her voice was breaking now, all the flat control gone. "Tova, I can't give it to you. It won't hold—" "I know," Tova said. "He's giving it to me. Watch his shoulder. When his coat streams flat and holds, that's my second. Call it with me." "Call it? You and me. Both. I don't fire till you see it too." Because this was the thing her sister had never quite been able to beat out of her, and the war finally had. She was not going to make this shot alone. 2 sets of eyes on the same 1-second truth. And if they both read it the same, it was real. Tova gave away the trigger to a shared read, because at 1,760 meters through a screaming gorge with 6 lives under the wire, trusting the other person was not weakness. It was the only math that closed. She settled into the rifle. She built her hold, the huge elevation for the range. A center wind she knew was a lie she'd correct in the instant. Everything stacked and ready to be finished by one variable she would take live off a stranger's coat. The bridge groaned across the gorge. The shooter's weapon flashed, and another round went into the wounded cable, and the span dropped an inch, and someone on the radio was praying out loud. "Standing by," Tova said, and her voice was the calmest thing in the entire valley. They waited for him to lean out. The gorge wind screamed. Below the bridge, the drop went down into blue shadow. On the far side, 1,760 meters away, a man in a loose dark garment crouched behind rock beside a cable he had almost cut, waiting out his own rhythm, and Tova lay behind the rifle with her heart rate flat, and the whole 9 days of arithmetic reduced now to a single living second she could not schedule and could only catch. Prieto's eye was locked to the spotting scope. Neither of them breathed. He leaned out. His coat came off his shoulder in the gust, and Tova read it, saw the fabric snap flat and streaming, saw the angle of it, and the hard violence that told her the gorge wind at his end was ripping right to left harder than her center hold, by a margin she computed and dialed into her hold in the space between 2 heartbeats, her whole sight picture shifting as she moved her point of aim off the cable and into the empty air to the right, where the wind would carry the round back. And in the scope beside her, Prieto saw the same coat stream flat and hold, and heard her own voice say, "Now!" At the exact instant, Tova's finger had already taken up the last ounce, the 2 of them landing on the same second from 2 sets of eyes, and Tova broke the shot. The rifle's report was different from every shot before it. A longer, heavier crack that rolled out over the gorge and kept rolling, and then the worst part, the part that lives at every long shot's heart, the weight. 1,760 meters is more than 2 full seconds of a bullet in the air, 2 seconds where it has already left and cannot be called back, and there is nothing to do but watch it be right or wrong. 2 seconds of a round, traveling through 3 different rivers of wind, holding the correction she'd read off a stranger's coat, while 6 people stood on a dying bridge, and a general stood in a tent with his hand over his mouth, and a 19-year-old supply clerk, who had wandered up to the berm to watch, stood with his heart stopped. The round crossed the gorge and struck the cable's anchor point beside the shooter's head, and it did 2 things at once, because it had to. It severed the wire the enemy had been feeding his rounds into. The compromised cable that would have failed anyway in another minute, cut now cleanly at the anchor, so the automatic tensioning on the far tower could seize and lock the redundant support, the way the bridge's engineers had built it to when a primary let go. And the fractional shift of that impact, the rock and wire, fragmenting at the shooter's position, ended the man behind it. One round, the cable and the shooter and the bridge, which shuddered and sagged and then held, the backup support snapping taut and catching the span with the ambulance, and 6 people frozen on it, 300 feet over the gorge floor. For a moment, the whole valley was silent. Then the radio erupted. 15, Prieto said, and then she couldn't say anything else, because she was crying and grinning at the same time, and had her hand pressed over her mouth. They got the 6 people off the bridge on foot, one at a time, across the span that Tova's shot had let the engineering catch. All 6 walked off it. The ambulance was recovered the next day, and the shot itself, 1,760 meters, into a 1-second exposure, through a channeled gorge wind, read live off a target's own clothing, to sever a specific cable and stop a specific man with a single round, was so far past the edge of believable that when the report first went up, the chain, a staff officer 3 echelons removed wrote in the margin that it was impossible, and someone had rounded up. They should not have written that down, because Ridgeback could prove it. The high pad had a spotting scope with a recording function that Prieto had been running out of habit, the same habit that made her log win no one wanted, and it had captured the whole thing: the range readout, the gorge, the shooter's exposures, the coat streaming in the gust, and the impact at the anchor. But it was more than the footage. The forward observer on the near side of the gorge had watched the cable part through his own optics and logged the time. The convoy's recovered vehicles carried the count of the road ambush. And the far shooter's position, when it was cleared 2 days later, held a heavy incendiary weapon and a spotting log of his own, and the range he had written for the cable, his own painstaking measurement of the distance he'd been firing across, matched Ridgeback's number to within a meter. 3 independent sources, and the dead man's own notebook, all saying the same impossible thing. The staff officer's margin note was struck out. In its place went the number, and the number stood, and it stands now in a record that a review board, once again, made her repeat under supervision before they would believe it. She repeated it, cold. Then she handed back the rifle and asked if there was anything else. When it was fully over, when the valley had gone quiet, and the wounded were evacuated, and the dust of it had settled back onto the ground it came from, Brigadier General Aldous Fenwick walked out to the eastern berm, where Tova was cleaning her rifle, on the pad in the last light, in the open, the way she'd cleaned it the first night when no one had given her a bunk. He stood at the edge of the pad for a while before he spoke. 30 years of certainty does not know how to hold itself in a moment like this. And he looked, for once, like exactly what he was. A man who had been wrong in a way that had almost cost 6 lives and a road full of people, and who had been saved from the full weight of that by the one person he'd decided wasn't worth a handshake. "I've been doing this a long time," he started, and stopped. His jaw worked. The words were not coming in the marching order he was used to. "I looked at you in that tent, and I made a decision about what you were, and I made it in about 1 second, and I have been making that same decision about people for 30 years, and calling it judgment." He stopped again. His hand, the one he had kept flat on the map, was not steady. "It wasn't judgment. It was, I didn't read your file. I didn't read past the first line. 6 people are alive, because you were better than the box I put you in. And I put you in it anyway. And I—" He couldn't finish the sentence the way he wanted to. He was a proud man, and the pride was in ruins, and there was no dignified path across the rubble. So he did the only thing left. He put out his hand. Tova looked at it. The same, offered hand, reversed now, held out across the same distance that had hung empty in the operations tent 9 days before. She let it wait 1 second. Not cruelty, arithmetic, the same as always, taking the exact measure of the moment. Then she set down her cleaning rod and took his hand and shook it once. "Should have read the file," she said. 2 words past the point, and they landed like the shot had. Fenwick let out something that was half a breath and half a broken laugh, and he nodded, and he held on to her hand a second longer than a handshake needs, and that was the apology finishing itself in the only language he had left. He kept it short after that, because some things don't need a speech. "You're off ammo counts," he said, and his voice was steadier now, back inside itself, but changed. "You're running your own element. Pick your people. I'll sign it tonight." He looked at her a moment longer. "That wasn't a marksman. I don't have a word for what that was." Dov Emmer had the word, as it turned out. The supply clerk had been on the berm for the second shot, had seen the whole impossible thing, and weeks later, when a new arrival at the firebase made a joke about the little corporal who ran the overwatch element, Dov set down what he was carrying and told the story plain, the way he'd seen it, and finished it with the thing he'd been trying to say since the first night and finally had the words for. "You don't get it," Dov said. "The rest of us were up there hoping. She was up there knowing. There's people alive right now who'd be dead, and not one of them will ever meet her. And she did the math on every single one of them, like it was just the count." He picked his load back up. "Somebody's got to be right about the numbers. She's always right about the numbers." Tova made the promised call from a better connection than usual, weeks later, to a range 2,000 miles away, where her sister was making some other underestimated kid. Do the math faster than fear. Yael answered on the second ring. They didn't talk about the shot, because they didn't need to. The record had traveled, and Yael had heard, and the only thing Yael said about it was 1760, in a gorge. And then quieter, the thing that had been the spine of all of it. "I told you you weren't small." "You did," Tova said. "Don't let them make you forget it." "I won't." She was cleaning the rifle again when she said it, hands moving in the old economy, the light going gold and then gray over the mountains. She had learned to read before anyone here knew. She could read anything at all. Somewhere far below, a general who had once decided, in a single second, exactly what a small, quiet woman was worth, sat with that certainty, in ruins around him, rebuilt now into something better and more humble. And every time, for the rest of his career, that he caught himself making that 1-second decision about a person, he would stop and read the file and remember the sound of his own voice saying 2 words he'd sworn he'd never say into a handset over a dying bridge. "Help me." And her voice coming back, level as still water, already done with the math the rest of them were still afraid to start. "I don't miss." She set the rifle down and looked east, level-eyed, at peace, and did not press anything to her chest, and did not need to. The arithmetic was still there. It always would be. Somebody had to be right about the numbers.